So this is trust and the human on the loop. Just to pick up some points from the abstract, this is a discussion about the presence of the human on the loop, and the on is different to the in, which Natasha will explain in a few minutes. But generally the thought is that having this human on the loop is a reassuring presence, it's a safeguard against unwanted harm, unexpected events, and also human beings can appreciate the ethical significance of things in a way that even the best autonomous systems can't. But then on the other side, there is a risk, both a safety risk and an ethical risk, of relying too heavily on that human on the loop without really thinking through the limitations upon them. And so that's what this panel discussion's about today. And we'll be looking at what some of those risks are and also how they might be mitigated. So just to do some very brief introductions, I'm Zoe Porter. I'm Research Associate at the Reassuring Autonomy International Programme at the University of York. And I'll just now move on. So Paul, would you like to introduce, and we'll go around in alphabetical order?
Hello, I'm Paul Cairns. I'm Professor of Human-Computer Interaction at the University of York, and also head of the Department of Computer Science, and so working closely with the Reassuring Autonomy International Programme because it's led out of computer science, for now anyway.
Thank you. So who's next alphabetically? So that's Aldo. Oh, Aldo's not here yet. So Lou, you there?
She was.
Yeah. All right, not to worry. Natasha then, and then Nick.
Sorry, I'm Natasha Merritt. I'm a professor of human factors and transport systems at the Institute for Transport Studies, University of Leeds.
Okay.
Hi everyone, yeah, my name is Nick Reed. I'm the founder of Reed Mobility, which is an independent consultancy working on connected and automated vehicle safety. I'm also a visiting professor at the University of Surrey 5G Innovation Centre.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, so I hope that Aldo and Lou will be able to join us shortly, but we can get started. So Natasha, you've done some work on what on the loop, the human on the loop means, and how that differs from the human in the loop. Could you just start by explaining a bit more about that?
Yes, if it's okay, Zoe, I'm just going to share my screen and show a few slides just to get everyone on the same page. So hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yeah.
So I want to start off with this SAE description of what we call automated, autonomous, self-driving, driverless. This is work I've been doing for a few years now, and just to have us all on the same page. And at the moment, we basically in this kind of levels 2 and 3 of automation, where in terms of human, it's described that we must be engaged with the driving task and monitor the environment in level 2. And in level 3, we're no longer required to monitor the environment, but we must be ready to take control of the vehicle at all times. So I've been working on what does that mean in terms of drivers' interactions with the vehicle using our driving simulator. And you can see here a video of someone on the phone while automation level 3 is on. And over here, actually, we've been looking at people looking straight ahead, not getting engaged in any activities like this guy is on, doing on their phone, and seeing how they respond when they have to take control of the level 2 or 3 automated vehicle. And what we see is that basically when automation is on, drivers look around a lot more than they would do if they were in control of the vehicle. They take longer to take control when they're asked to. The quality of taking that control is quite poor, which leads to crashes and what we call a sort of a broken perceptual motor link. So the link between their driving, where they're looking, where they're steering is broken, and that sort of affects the quality of their control, leading to more crashes. And one of the issues is around not understanding what's going on. So the incorrect mental model, am I in charge? Is it in charge? And so on. So we worked with a group of international human factors experts in US, Europe, and Japan, looking at trying to describe this phenomenon, which many people say, oh, the driver's out of the loop. Well, we wanted to sort of say, what does this mean in a bit more detail? So we basically put 3 categories now: out of the loop, in the loop, and on the loop, which is what you're particularly interested in. And it's around this idea of actually being in physical control, but actually also monitoring. So when you're in the loop, for example, in your manual driving, you're physically in control of the vehicle and you're monitoring the driving environment, compared to when you're on the loop in automation, when you're no longer in physical control, but you're still required to monitor the driving environment, especially for level 2. And then finally, when you're out of the loop, you're neither in physical control nor are you monitoring, which can happen in level 2 and level 3. Or actually, you can see that in manual driving, where you might be in physical control, but you're not monitoring. And here we need to define what we mean by monitoring. So we are talking about the driver physically looking at the driving scene, looking at what's happening in the vehicle, but it can also be, it should be that they are cognitively aware of what's going on. So their mind and their eyes need to be engaged. And just to sort of show how it's important to have both. So this is some work done by colleagues at Volvo Cars, similar to the studies we've done in the driving simulator, where they basically got people to take control after automation was engaged. And they found that around 28% of people were looking at what was going on and still crashed. So here it's about whether they were sort of not cognitively engaged, or there was a mismatch, as the paper suggests, between what they thought their role was and what their role actually was. So they thought the automation was taking control, and actually they didn't take control quickly enough. So this being on the loop is quite sort of, you know, we need to think about it in a little bit more detail and describe what does that mean in terms of physical engagement, cognitive engagement, having your eyes on the right area and knowing what you have to do. And just my last slide on that, just to say that we've done lots of work in the simulator, but we've seen now more and more that is happening. Things are happening where unintended consequences of these systems, where people basically decide to fall asleep, move out of the driving seat in some cases. And so there's been suggestions about having some kind of driver monitoring to make sure the driver is kept on the loop. But I've put underlined and italicized reliable, because we're not quite there yet, unfortunately, in terms of these systems and integrating them with the vehicle. That's what's important. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. So just to give a bit of a flavour, really.
Thank you. So, so Nick, does that sort of stuff, is that commensurate with the things that you've been finding in your research as well? Is it a similar picture that you've been seeing?
Absolutely, yeah. So and the presentation Natasha gave reminded me of some work done by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety in America, where they had a level 2 vehicle. So the driver should be monitoring the environment and that whilst the vehicle is in control. And on a 1-hour drive, they drove past the participant's vehicle with a giant pink teddy bear strapped to the back of the overtaking vehicle. And at the end of the drive, they asked people if they'd seen anything unusual whilst they were completing the test drive. And the majority of people didn't. So I think that kind of tallies with Natasha's point there about making sure mind and eyes are engaged in the task. In terms of the work I've been doing, some of the recommendations that were made to the European Commission on the ethics of connected and automated vehicles, I think are relevant in this space. So some of that work is about the decisions an automated vehicle might make when it's in control of the driving task. But some of it is also about the ethics of the design of the vehicle and making sure that we design vehicles to operate in a safe way that is cognizant of the fact that when drivers are asked to monitor the driving task rather than physically engage in it, that's a difficult task for humans. Their mind wanders. There are a multitude of distractions that might take their attention. So creating a system where you are expecting a driver to respond rapidly to an emerging situation is setting the system up to fail. So there's lots of factors we need to consider about how much the driver is aware that the function exists on the vehicle, but also how it works. Is it operating? How much control does it have? How does it draw the driver back into the loop when it's necessary? How long do they have to do that? So lots of questions to be answered there.
Yeah, indeed. So I've just seen Lou's arrived, and I know that this is her area as well, automotive. So Lou, are you still there?
Yes, sorry about some technical issues. First time using the WebEx.
No worries.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm talking about on the loop in automotive, and I know that this is where you've done quite a lot of research as well. So it'd probably be a good time to hear a bit more about that, if you are able to. I think you had a demo or something to share.
Yeah, not sure how to share my sharing is also disabled in the app, so probably I can just talk about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have been doing something. So I'm based in the University of Virginia in the US. And in our lab, we have a driving simulator, and we've been trying to do some user studies about like humans' trust, of course, in a controlled lab environment. But we try to see how different like driving conditions or different alarms or different road incidents, like maybe pedestrian crossing the road, or basically, let's see how when different autonomous vehicles, they handling the incidents maybe successfully or failed, how would that affect the driver's trust? So one interesting thing we did in our study is traditionally in the literature, if you see how users are surveyed about their trust, it's usually their user questionnaire that at the end of the experiments, we will ask some in the studies, they will ask the participants, can you rate, maybe give some ratings about your trust about autonomous driving, which is the traditional practice. In our user studies, we tried to modify our driving simulator settings so that we can collect the real-time data about the users' surveys. So basically, we ask the users, there are some buttons on the driving simulator the users can press, and then can give us in the real time their change of their trust values, which is very helpful for us to study about the dynamics of trust. Because some of the previous work have found that the human's trust is not a static value. In like different person come to the lab or maybe starting to using the autonomous car, you all have your own prior experience or background knowledge about the car. That gives a very different initial trust. But also when we found in our study that even in a short duration of experiments, maybe less than 1 hour, we do find that users' trust do change dramatically. And a lot of times it's kind of coupled with their experience with how the performance of the autonomous cars. And of course, we are just starting to explore this area, but I think this is definitely still a very rich research area with lots of open research questions to explore about.
Thanks, Lou. So some themes are emerging about this disconnect between minds and eyes, the ability really to monitor. What does monitoring mean, and how meaningful is that in context, as well as looking at the dynamics of trust and how trust changes, and how people bring their own prior experience to bear, and how that affects their ability to do things like monitor vehicles on the road. So do these things map across to other domains? So Aldo, you're in the healthcare domain, and Paul, you know about air traffic control. So if we could just sort of see how this generalizes across other domains, and then I'll go to a few questions that have come up in the Q&A. Yeah, so over to Aldo, please.
Yes, hi, thank you. And apologies for showing up late. I had broadband problems at home. And so, yeah, so we are working here at Imperial College on a system that we call the AI Clinician, together with clinicians and researchers in York in safety systems, but also people who work on human factors, including neuroscientists, and we'll get to that in a second. So our system is basically not a diagnostic AI system. It doesn't work out whether you have a disease or not, but what it is used in is once we know that you have the disease and we monitor your vital signs in intensive care, can we work out how we have to basically change settings dynamically on a day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute basis, so as to maximize your survival chances if you suffer from an infectious disease such as sepsis. And just to give you a sense of sepsis, virtually every person who dies from COVID in intensive care unit dies with sepsis. So it's one of the biggest killers. It's the third biggest killer worldwide from hospital-related diseases. And it's one of the primary cost factors driving healthcare costs 12 billion in the UK alone. So sepsis is a big challenge, and what we don't understand is how to basically manage sepsis once it has arisen. So in our system, we've basically use reinforcement learning technologies. So these are machine learning technologies that are interactive. They learn from experience how to make decisions so future decisions works better. And that same technology is actually used in self-driving cars as well. You know, it's not about how to get to London by following what road signs, but how to keep driving so that you don't hit people and arrive in London. And so the challenge is here is how we can communicate and use the system. So this is not an autonomous system that just injects drugs or changes settings. It's a recommender system that tells or recommends to intensive care doctors why they should do something. And they can choose, of course, to ignore it if they think it's unsafe, or if they're not convinced that the system works. And so there are a number of challenges here that we need to look at. On the technical side, the interesting thing is we have data sets that exceed multiple lifetime experiences of clinicians. So I think there is a good starting point for that. But where the AI technologies fail is in explanation. So why am I doing what am I doing? It's easy perhaps if you just want to recognize an image, an object on an image, and I say, okay, you know, the cup is a cup because it has a round shape at the top. But if you have a policy, so a system that determines how to change drugs all over the place, given that a patient is in some form of abstract state, that becomes much harder to quantify. And it's also much harder for the doctors to try to explain what exactly the state of a patient is. And for example, when they're handing over between shifts, there's quite a bit of interaction going on where they're trying to describe, based on common experiences they had over the past few weeks, how this patient is doing and where they're going. And basically now we have an AI system that has just abstracted the data, and we need to render this explainable. And this is where, in our view, experimental psychology and cognitive neuroscience comes into play, because we need to understand how do people render or think about abstract concepts. We visualize them. We can put things that have no physical relationship in the real world into relationships into our mind. We can say things are closer, things are further away. If we understand how these things are organized and how the human mind thinks about it, what algorithm the human mind runs, we can basically create algorithms in AI systems that are more human-like, and then we can render these representations or these explanations. Other ways that you can think about the problem that we're facing is the problem of trust, as it has come up repeatedly. And one thing that we don't have is that we're not exploiting the fact that we can actually measure how much trust a person puts in a system. In the case of our doctors, it's simply, are they following our recommendation or not? And if they're not, that's very valuable information that our system should use to learn how to either improve its decision because it was a bad decision, or how to improve its explanation. And interestingly, we can use, again, reinforcement learning that learns from this trust interaction how to improve how it communicates with other people.
Thank you. So that's interesting. So now we're looking at a similar set of issues, but in the loop rather than on the loop, because this is about recommender systems. But it's interesting that similar sorts of risks arise. And you've given some thoughts about how those might be mitigated, which I might come back to you to speak on when I look at some of the questions. But also what you said about measuring trust, that seems very much to tie in what Lou was talking about. I don't know if you would agree, Lou, about these measuring the dynamics of trust. Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I agree. So, and actually, in my research lab, we are also working with doctors about adding more explainability to the clinical decision-making system. And I have to say that's much harder than the vehicles. I'm not saying that's actually easier problem, but it's the clinical decision support. It's very complex, and sometimes it requires certain kind of to understand what's going on with the patient physiology, and it's extremely difficult to explain what's going on. But I agree, I think there are definitely similarities in both domains about humans' trust in a kind of AI, in whether it's an autonomous car's decision-making or it's a clinical support system's decision-making, definitely needs a lot of trust.
Thanks. So if Paul's there, we could speak a little bit about air traffic control, and then move on to some of the questions.
Yeah, I think it is interesting to make the contrast with air traffic control in particular, because I think they're in a situation there of what are you basically trying to achieve? You're basically trying to achieve an abstract privative state, an absence of problems, which is called safety. So you're trying to maintain air safety in essentially a dynamic context. And whilst in principle there are already systems that could autonomously control air traffic, the question is, and I think it's kind of what's been hinted at already, is it safe? In other words, can we be sure, because we can't let these things out loose in the real world until it's safe. And I think the reason why possibly driverless cars have made more progress than, say, autonomous air traffic control is because with driverless cars, for instance, you have a safe state, which is the car stops. It's not entirely safe, but it's if things are going wrong, there is a safe state which can be achieved, or you can work towards stopping the car and achieving that state. That's not an option with an airplane. And so you end up with a situation where the safety of the overall system is currently entirely through highly trained teams of individuals. So not any one person is responsible for the overall air safety. It's a collective endeavor. So if you introduce automation into that, what you're essentially doing is you're introducing something making decisions who is not human. And they can maintain things within boundaries, but again, you then hit on several problems. One of which is we've already discussed, as Aldo was talking about. Well, what's it doing? Why is it doing what it's doing? And that explainability is crucial for the team to have confidence in it. And the other thing is, how does it communicate it to the team as well? Okay, and that's not trivial. For all the fact that ATC is highly, they're highly trained and highly skilled. They have their own language. There is a way of being within teams that is, as with many human-computer interaction problems, is very hard to specify what exactly is that way of being an ATC in a team. So I think it's hitting on a lot of the themes there. I think the issue of trust is less the case, because at the moment all air traffic controllers, they are the source of trust, and so simply anything which isn't an air traffic controller isn't trustworthy. And that also means that they want to monitor these devices, any system, software, whatever you might put in. The current expectation is that they have to monitor it, because that's how you get the safety. But of course, as we've just seen, that's not practical. That's when people make lots of mistakes. And air traffic controllers, it doesn't matter how well trained they are, you can't train for persistent vigilance that's required in monitoring tasks. So there's a tension there, which the people we've been working with, Nathan Hughes and myself, have been working with the NATS, the National Air Traffic Service, to try and understand just what are the barriers to changing the way air traffic control teams work with automation.
So would any of the panelists just like to pick up on any of those points before I just go to the first question? Yeah, Natasha, yeah.
Don't mind. Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited about the sorts of things that Paul is saying, because that side of things has been working for a lot longer than driverless cars. But basically, we are now in a situation where we're moving from the human being in control of a lot of things to a mixture of the human and the automated systems, etc., being in control. And what we don't have is the knowledge of how that works together. So if a fully foolproof system, which in some cases is available, is completely in control of particular tasks, that works well. And the same with the humans, and we are good at some things and it's good at some things. But what we're having now is this mixture of, is it me, is it you, when is it me, when is it you, how do I know that? So interfaces that allow, human machine interfaces that allow that collaboration are essential, and designing those well to make sure that the human, and I'm speaking from driver's point of view, they are not as trained as any of the people that Paul works with. So there's a lot to be understood in that regard. And until we are there, we're in this kind of mixture, and trust is sometimes misused because we don't want too much trust, because then that leads to sort of breakdowns and issues. So it's that kind of the right trust and the right time is really important. But yeah, we need to sort of learn from the different disciplines, but whether it's healthcare or aviation or driving, it is about the human and the system working together, trusting each other, understanding what each of them does. And we're only, at least in driving, we're only at the start of that process.
Can I just come back there, Zoe? I think that's a really interesting point. I just challenge whether there really is a situation, say, in air traffic control, where there is an entirely autonomous system. You're right, that middle section that we're currently at is where it's particularly a problem for driverless cars. But I think in air traffic control, I don't think there'll ever be a situation where we view it as safe if there was an entirely autonomous system, because any unanticipated event will require intervention.
Yeah.
There's no way that you can sort of be completely devoid of, for instance, the weather, the classic unknown, certainly in this country anyway. But also, failures, machine failures, engineering failures on aircraft themselves, or possibly even individual human failures on aircraft as well. And so that air traffic control problem, I wonder if it ever could be fully autonomous. And so there's always be some sort of federated. We'll never hit that. I can't remember, it was level 6 or 7 in your diagram, but whether we'll ever hit that in ATC.
Well, that's good. I mean, I was actually talking about aviation rather than air traffic control, so right. The pilot things, apologies for that. But I do want to come back to a point you made about vigilance. And I think that's really, really important, and understanding of how long we can be vigilant as human beings is not really appreciated. So there is this assumption. So in my field, we now have safety drivers who are trained. I don't know how well they are trained, but there is the assumption that if a trained safety driver is in the vehicle, then it's okay. And I'm forever saying we are all humans, and regardless of how much training we get, we will be distracted. We will, you're sitting there, you're looking at it, but your mind is on tonight's dinner. It's as simple as that. So really, an understanding of that is really very important.
Yeah, I agree. Just to finish that point, I think vigilance comes with engagement. You actually need to be actively involved and acting in order to maintain your attention. As it's the difference between, as you say, watching something and doing something. And when you're doing, you can maintain that vigilance for longer. But then the question is, what are you doing if the autonomous system is doing it? So there we go.
Exactly. Yeah. You can see similarities, Zoe.
No, that's a good point, isn't it? There's that sort of almost this dilemma of like, if you have to be vigilant, then what's the role of the system? but you know, it's always the devil's in the detail. But I saw you nodding there, Aldo, because I should imagine this question of vigilance is extremely important in healthcare as well. Do you see?
Well, I think the problem is in some ways it's reversed, of course, because what happens is that globally healthcare systems are stressed simply because we have aging populations, irrespective of a pandemic going on, and we have a substantial unmet need that we need to somehow make up for, because there's simply not enough doctors and nurses to provide you that level of personal care that you actually require. So I think the acceptance here of a system that basically continuously looks at you and see how you're doing will provide potentially better vigilance than a nurse running around 30 beds and occasionally dropping in on you, simply because they're so overloaded to a certain sense. But I think the challenge that arises when we're talking about these type of human AI interaction systems is my trust is not your trust. And only because we both know a person, we may trust that person very differently, and trust does not propagate. And this becomes important when you have human AI interaction. For example, self-driving cars can perfectly tune themselves to a driver or the passenger's wishes. But every new pedestrian needs to reestablish trust with that car when they're trying to cross the zebra crossing in front of it. And probably it's going to have to do a lot with the names or interfaces that cars display, because when you cross the road, you look the driver in the eye and make sure that they have seen you. So there are different ways how trust can appear. So suppose in air traffic control, it's always the same traffic controller that is basically supported by an AI, so you can build a relationship. In traffic settings, maybe not. And similarly, in some hospital settings, if you have AI systems that interact directly with patients, you need to rebuild the trust. To do that, we require user models that can model, measure, and adapt trust into the AI system, because this becomes an important parameters of what you want to communicate and how you want to act. Maybe you more careful if you don't know about something about anyone, and while if you believe you have established a relationship with a human, then the AI system can be a bit more make a bit more assumptions in that, and that's actually what we humans do as well. So I think we should move away from AI systems just processing stuff. We should think about them as agents, and once we think about them as agents or personas, then really it changes a bit how we're thinking about them.
Interesting. So you're thinking that this that actually, as part of this, trying to find a way to make the human on the loop or the human in the loop as safe as possible, we also need to think about how the human regards the system, and that relationship is just as key as how everybody around the system regards the human in the loop, and so forth. And also talking about these multiple different humans on the loop in the automotive domain. That's really interesting. Nick, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, no, I've been really interested in what both Aldo and Lou were saying about trust and explainability, especially in these safety critical situations where you really want to know why the system is behaving as it is, and will it do the same thing again next time? Taking out as example the zebra crossing, is it definitely going to stop for the pedestrian who has chosen to walk out onto the pedestrian crossing? So I think what we'll need is robust data about the information that the system is using on which to base its decisions. We don't necessarily need to know how it's coming to the conclusions, but the data that it's using to come to those decisions. But where that takes us is quite an awkward place in terms of trust related to privacy, because we might need a lot of data from the vehicle about where it's going, what it's seeing. And I think there's maybe a question mark about how much we trust in that collection of data that might come about because of the requirements to assure safety. We venture into territory that might be uncomfortable on the kind of privacy and security grounds.
Okay, so I'm going to go. We've got about 20 minutes, so there are some. I'm going to just have a look at some questions and put them to you. So the first question, and this can tie into questions around okay, so here are all the problems and here are all the complexities and here are all the things we have to manage, to what are the best ways to actually do that. So it's a question from Pete Wright. It's the first question about whether this risk or this potentially false reassurance on the human on or in the loop points to having an all or nothing approach. Is that the way forward? Is the most practical way forward to just go either fully autonomous or not? Or do you think it should be a bit more, and from what you've been saying, I think I can anticipate what your answers will be, but it'd be interesting to hear you hear you say them. So should we go all or nothing, or are there other ways to get around this problem? Anybody who wants to jump in first?
I think for me, so Google, when they were setting out on their self-driving car project, shifted from a partial automation to a more fuller automation approach because of these issues around partial automation. I think that what we don't really understand yet is the safety benefit of the halfway house. We do know lots of people die on the roads currently. Many of those collisions are due to errors, mistakes made by humans, whether it's poor speed choice, misjudged junctions, fatigue, and a lot of those collisions can be prevented by partial automation systems, but we don't know what the extent of the new risks that might emerge through the presence of those partial automation systems. So I'm optimistic, but I think there's more work to be done by the likes of Natasha and her team and many others around how we balance those risks.
Yeah, thanks for that, Nick. Just to sort of follow on, absolutely, driver assistance systems are super useful, from electronic stability control to automated emergency braking, things that will help avoid crashes are in our cars and are making us safer. But it is that kind of ceding of control and that mixture of who is in control when, which we just don't have enough knowledge about. And we will avoid some crashes, but we will see new because of this unintended consequences. And I always say humans want to break things. So if you put them in a situation where they will find ways around it. So at the moment, the ALKS was coincidentally mentioned yesterday, and there's this sort of 30 seconds, every 30 seconds, you're supposed to re-engage. Well, there are stories of how people find ways of re-engaging, whether it's in automation or actually on trains, where they're not actually engaging at all, but finding ways of using their foot or whatever and continuing to look at their email. So we really have to be aware of what humans are like when it comes to dealing with systems, and then sort of finding solutions to that. So yes, I do agree that, and that's the business model that some manufacturers have taken, that they're not going to go out and have this sort of given to the lay person until they are absolutely confident. So there's sort of other environments that they can be used in when maybe there are no pedestrians and cyclists and etc., and sort of low speeds, hospitals, car parks, to test it, to see what we can get, and then go on to the real road.
So you're advocating this gradual approach as we learn more about the interactions and just get all of that sort of richer knowledge that we perhaps couldn't just anticipate in advance.
Yeah, gradual, not in the real road. So not having it in the cars available this year, as some systems are being going to.
Yeah, Aldo, in healthcare, I mean, I should imagine that all or nothing isn't really a practical option. How would you respond to that question?
I think again, it really depends on what settings we are. If it's about a diagnostic system that aids a radiologist in recognizing a cancer, and it says it's that, and that's one thing. It's a one-off interaction. If you have systems that continuously interact with you, set AI clinician, but also other technologies, I don't know, things that help you with your mental health, for example, or other technologies help you with dosing drugs, for example, from home, then you're working with humans that are non-experts, and I think we need to differentiate. And I think, sorry, this may sound like a one-size-fits-all answer, but it's really about trying to build models of the individuals and learn them. So we are aware of how they tick. We've done work on personality scores of people, where we look at the big five personality features. If you believe in these or not, it's a way of mapping people to how neurotic, how introverted or extroverted they are. But the interesting thing, you get these numbers out of questionnaires that you give people, or you have a psychiatrist or psychologist assess them. But we're finding systematic behavioral differences when they're responding to recommendations and how they're responding to recommendations in a trial that we ran with 450 people in a mental health lab. And so I think the whole discourse should shift away from computer science in some ways towards call it human factors, neuroscience, psychology, because it's actually us that is the AI systems are there to interact with us. They make our life better, and so we need. It's about shifting the focus. And once you do that, I think a lot of these questions relax themselves a bit, because we're not building bridges, right? We're building systems that we work with. That's different.
Yeah. Okay, that ties in with a question that's just coming. If my eyes seem to be darting away, it's just because I'm trying to keep an eye on the question. So so apologies to those in the audience if these are not in order. So is the idea that if a human can do it, a machine can do it, correct? If so, then will machines monitor themselves? Anybody like to pick up on that? Yeah, Aldo?
Yeah, I can take that for image-based tasks. So if you have an image and a human can recognize something on it, be it a very complicated medical image or something else, then generally it is said that a machine can learn it, provided you give sufficient data. So at that simple level, at what I call perceptual AI, when you reproduce perceptual effects, I think it's fairly straightforward.
Thanks. Anybody else?
My path to the study of automated vehicles has been through seeing the risks that human drivers are willing to take, their willingness to engage in texting whilst driving, the effects of fatigue, the effects of alcohol, the effects of drugs on our ability to drive, and the potential for technology to support and reduce the collision risk. So it's more that the humans can't do it in some situations, and the technology can help us to avoid those risky situations. And in terms of machines monitoring themselves, I certainly think for an automated vehicle, redundancy in its sensor systems is going to be really important. So if nothing else, for reasons of cybersecurity, if one system has been broken, maybe the others can compensate and ensure that safe control of the vehicle is retained, even in some degraded form. So yeah, a degree of redundancy around the sensors that are used, so that the machines monitoring themselves is going to be really important.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and on the perception side, I've got a couple of examples of studies where the image processing it has some way to go. So there's a classic one from, I think it was North America somewhere, I can't remember, but so a stop sign where a couple of little stickers on the stop sign made the machine think it was a 40-mile-an-hour sign. And so we humans would clearly see it as a stop sign, but the machine picked it up as something else. So I think we've got a bit of a way to go in terms of that image processing for the vehicles, to be sure that they are so they are good at some things, better at some things than we are, and vice versa. The sort of the classic mama concept. So we're not there yet that we can say yes, everything that we can do, they can do too. Okay, thank you. This ties in actually to a question from Jazz. The relationship between perception and trust of what is experienced or observed is not simply a cognitive factor, but also an emotional and compliance factor. Future systems must be able to use AI to detect and sense these parameters to shape response and control.
So how could such factors that are not deterministic, oh, maybe it's not exactly, I just sort of picked up on the emotion. I thought, oh yeah, that's something else that that we do that machines don't do terribly well. So perhaps it isn't quite directly, but just to pick up on this not being a cognitive factor, but also an emotional and compliance factor. Have you got anything to add, Natasha, about the emotional side of human beings, as well as our ability to, you know, detect stickers on stop signs and stuff?
Certainly, Aldo mentioned something around different people, their sort of, you know, their level of trust, etc. That's you know, I don't necessarily deal with the emotional side of things yet, but I can say that this individual differences is a huge area that is unexplored, and certainly most of the research still continues to be focused on a very small sample size, too homogeneous, and there's a huge range of capabilities, experiences, etc. Younger people, older people, who are completely missed from the research, and so that sort of, you know, on that side of things, characteristics, personalities do make a difference. But I don't have anything to add on the emotional side myself. Sorry.
Right. Okay.
Can I just pick up on that? I think one of the things with emotion is that it's a different way of thinking. It's a different activity of our brain, and there are different models of it. And I think we often think of sort of, if we knew how people think, we know what they're doing. But of course, actually, emotion has been postulated as a sort of almost a different thinking mechanism that interrupts what might be a sort of a logical, careful, formal way of thinking, in order to attend to the tiger in the woods or wherever it is. You know, something is going wrong. You need to stop doing what you're doing and allocate resources elsewhere. And that's one model of emotion. It's like poking through from a different sensory input. But I think it also points to the way that there's another way of thinking, which is when we think about our thinking, so a metacognition, and that's the basis for explainable actions. So we not only can I tell you why I thought this, I can also, not only did I do something sensible, I can tell you why I did something sensible and why I thought it was sensible and why I think my explanation is a good one. So, you know, we can keep going up, and that's where AI is problematic, is that it only thinks one way. It has the thing it's been trained to do and to think about. What it can't do is be interrupted from something else. It doesn't, allocate resources when it needs to be, and it can't think about why it's thinking that way at the moment.
Yeah. And that's interesting, isn't it? If we talk about AI explainability and the role that explanations play in our thinking, and how can the explainability techniques fit into that to provide a rounded explanation of decisions that you make on the basis of a recommendation for an autonomous system. Okay, so this is another question that I think will engage Paul as well, because it touches on the air traffic control thing, but it's actually relevant to all, particularly Aldo and Paul, I think. So this is especially on human behaviours, complexity and planning for unexpected scenarios. All right, so that's what's was interesting. I'd like to hear more about training models based on the behaviours of a team rather than the individual, because there's so much about team dynamics, human team dynamics. So interdisciplinary healthcare team working to rescue a patient suffering from sepsis, or a pilot, co-pilot air traffic controller who work as a team to address adverse weather or engine failure. Paul, would you like to start and then try Aldo, or the other way around? I don't.
Yeah, I think this team issue, you know, that idea of a sort of a cognition within a team, we know it's a thing, but I think we're very poor at understanding it. I mean, it relies on individual cognition. It relies on theory of mind. So I think you're thinking what I think you're thinking, which is really important to be able to model, and relies on a shared, a true shared understanding. It's not really that I think you're like me. There's actually a truth behind that as well. And I don't think we have a handle on it at all. I don't think we've got any sense of what a cognitive model of a team would look like. In particular, and just to throw in further things into that, is that we know of distributed cognition, where we throw some of the things we're thinking about out into the world so we don't have to bother about them. So for instance, we put something down somewhere so that we know when we come back to that place, we'll pick it up again and use it, but we've stopped thinking about it. It's become part of the world around us. So yeah, I think we have very poor understanding of how, well, I think we have really limited understanding of how things work just inside one head. I think inside multiple heads sitting in a real world, I think we're very poor understanding.
Interesting. Aldo?
So I think this is, especially if you talk about medicine, you have interdisciplinary teams where doctors from different specialties come together. And in fact, actually, one stream of our AI clinician work is now at basically thinking about adding an AI into this team and what you need to do to make this AI a useful team member. I mean, it's infinitely dumb, but infinitely knowledgeable in facts. So how does this change the composition of a team in that respect? If we're going though to Paul's question, which I think is very important, is how do we start modeling these things? How do we understand these? And of course, I don't have to work out if I'm with a group of climbers, for example, going up a mountain. I don't need to have a theory of mind of all of them. I just need to have reasonable safety assumptions about that they're not going to do something crazy for me to be able to cooperate with them. So we need some knowledge, but not infinite knowledge. And interestingly, of course, if you're looking into AI, there's a whole theory around multi-agent systems, we call them, where you see that systems where everything is homogeneous because it's just copies of an identical software running, have certain ways of guarantees to be able to operate. But of course, you then find if you take systems where every element is completely different from the other, then you actually find a lot more robustness, because the fact that the system needs to be able to account for the differences across each thing, that there's lack of knowledge how the other thing actually operates, ensures that if they've learned to somehow play together at some superficial level, and that's enough also for human collaboration, say consider traffic, right? Then you will find that these systems operate also in more extreme or unusual cases in a more robust way. And so I think it, again, apologies for that, it goes back about thinking about the models of the individuals and how we can user model them to then extrapolate some dynamics. But I don't think we need to have a complete understanding of other systems.
And Lou, does this tie in at all to thinking about the dynamics between different people around an autonomous vehicle? Is that something that you've been looking at in your work as well?
I think what Adam mentioned about multi-agent systems and the trust, it's definitely very interesting. So right now we're only look at like even just between the one driver and one machine, but I think going forward, especially nowadays with all the connected vehicles, it's definitely going to be a multi-agent system kind of formulation would be something interesting to explore.
Mm-hmm. With human agents as part of that multi-agent system, yeah.
Yes.
Just to add to that, one area is the suggestion of remote controllers for automated vehicles. So that's probably it's been done for other automated systems, sort of, you know, in off-road sort of situations. But now there are suggestions that if an automated vehicle breaks down and the driver has been disengaged, maybe been asleep or whatever, or has a heart attack, God forbid, then what do we do about it? So there is this discussion around a remote operator will come in and move the vehicle out of the way, etc. So that's really probably a good example of how in the future this idea of teamwork between the various actors is suggested, with the research on that pretty non-existent when it comes to human factors.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right, so there's only 3 minutes left. This is perhaps unfair, but a nice way to round it up would be to ask each of you, what do you think is the one most important or pressing thing to be the most pressing question in this area? So apologies if that's too open and difficult, but we haven't really spoken. We've spoken a little bit about mitigation and stuff, but just think, you know, in terms of solving these issues, what is the most important thing to think about in terms of human-machine interaction and trying to make sure that the human on or in the loop is actually a reassuring safeguard, and not that too much has been placed on them that they don't have the capacities, whether psychological or cognitive or whatever, to actually fulfill that role. So apologies if I've just thrown that at you, but perhaps just, you know, just a couple of words each, and then I think we've come to the end of our time. So Natasha, you go first.
Thanks. I'm just I love this kind of event, and I think that's what we need to do more of, and more talking across the disciplines.
Right.
So for the last sort of 15 years or so, while I've been engaged very much on the automated vehicle side, I'm seeing a shift, and I'm seeing an appreciation of the human as part of this. These developments, so not just systems and engineering on their own, but understanding what the human does. There's still a little bit of sort of there's words like the driver needs to accept it, and I don't like that, because that's like, here it is, what do you think of it? So really the human-centered approach and a multidisciplinary approach across the field, and I think we will get there, definitely.
Thank you. Lovely. Okay, Lou, what do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Natasha said about we definitely need more dialogues, interdisciplinary research, more dialogues between domain experts, because there has been decades of great research in human factors. But us as computer scientists, it's relatively new for us to now start to thinking about all these human factors when we design systems. So I really like the words when people think we need to build human-centered systems or human-centered AI. I think that's going forward when we even like teach the next generation of engineers or our students. This is something we should emphasize.
Lovely, thanks. Aldo.
So AI and machine learning are the most transformative technology since we invented the wheel. It's ultimately because it's not humans who need to build a solution. Instead, it's machines that learn how to find the solution. And if we want to apply that to autonomy, trust, and explanation, then we really need models for how humans trust, learn, and understand explanations. So human-centered, again, question here, so that an AI can learn how to do that.
Thank you. Okay, Nick, what do you think is the most important thing to take this forward?
Well, for an automated vehicle where we're combining AI and wheels, I think that the most important thing is that we have data to enable us to have that trust, that explainability of why the system behaves as it does, and give us the confidence that it will behave as we expect it to, increasing safety performance.
Thanks. Okay, and finally, Paul.
Hi, people have said some good things, but I think for me the key thing to take things forward is to think about changing what we're doing in order to to divide what we're trying to achieve into the domains of where people have the things have the ability. So the AI is good at some things and the humans are good at other things. Humans aren't good at monitoring. AIs aren't very good at explaining what they're doing. So can we, how do we divide things, and how do we understand that on the basis of data, models, and things that everyone's talked about, in order to sort of say, well, what's the right federation between humans and autonomous systems?
Great, thank you. That's a fantastic note to end on. So thanks everybody for your participation and all of your insights. It looks from the chat that people have found this an interesting session. So just all my thanks. And I think now, Emery, I just click out. But
I'm just going to
all the best to all of you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Very much appreciated. Thank you.
Bye.